Why have a growing number of immigrants applied to become U.S. citizens? The answer may surprise you. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States government reports that the rate of immigrants becoming American citizens has skyrocketed, with applications over the past year up 32% to nearly 1 million legal immigrants. Why the surge? Many say it's because they want to vote in this year's presidential election, an election in which Republican candidate Donald Trump's tough immigration stance has left them concerned about U.S. immigration policy. CCTV's Jessica Stone has more from Houston, Texas.
Do we have any Houston, Texas fans in the house today? Houston, Texas! Here you go!
History and music have knit Mexicans and Texans together since the 1800s.
I'm Maria Mendoza.
Maria Mendoza has lived in Houston for decades, but only recently passed the U.S. citizenship exam. Her motivation, worry that a win by Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump could force her to be deported. Trump has labeled many Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals.
I feel some candidate not like Mexican people, but it's very important vote.
According to the U.S. government, applications for U.S. citizenship and the voting rights it brings are up 32% over last year. And the increase is overwhelming the system, leaving as many as 500,000 applications held up by slow processing times.
This cycle in 2016 is completely different than in 2012. The level of interest in the Latino community has grown exponentially.
Carlos Duarte says it's not just Trump's tough talk on immigration that scares Mexicans and Mexican Americans. It's also his rejection of the North American Free Trade Agreement, a deal that helps sustain more than 1 million jobs in the Port of Houston alone. There's also something else. Houston has the third largest Mexican-born population in the entire United States. Nearly everyone here knows a new U.S. citizen or someone who's undocumented. For 18-year-old Larissa Gonzalez, this U.S. presidential election is a chance to help those who don't yet have work papers ultimately become like her, a legal U.S. citizen.
If I have the chance to at least try and make the change and give it a try, give it a shot, then I will. Because it's their future that is at risk.
Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton is trying to attract the votes of Hispanic and other immigrant groups. She favors a path to citizenship for the millions of undocumented people already living in the United States.
Nada, todo fue muy emocionante.
But for Maria Mendoza, it's not about a political party, but a desire for the next U.S. president to respect the country's immigrants.
No open for everyone, for everybody, no. But compassion for the people, work hard, stay here.
You have a voice that deserves to be heard.
Jessica Stone, CCTV, Houston, Texas.
Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining us from San Francisco is David Lee. In addition to teaching political science at San Francisco State University, he serves as the executive director of the Chinese American Voters Committee. Also with us is Imam Talib Sharif from Masjid Muhammad, a historic mosque here in Washington, D.C. George Lujan is a communications organizer with the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Thomas Holbrook is the department chair and a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with Thomas in Milwaukee. And Thomas, how important is this immigrant vote in the forthcoming election? Could it, in a very closely fought election, tip the balance?
Well, it's hard to say how much difference the new immigrant vote could make, because even though there's a substantial increase this year in terms of raw numbers compared to the American electorate, it's still fairly small. But the growing immigrant citizen population overall, that is not just new citizens, but people who have been naturalized over the past several decades, that is increasingly a Democratic bloc of voters and increasingly concentrated in a few states, a few key states that are battleground states, Florida, for example, North Carolina has a growing immigrant population, citizen immigrant population. In these battleground states in particular, this voting bloc, which is increasingly Democratic, could be very important.
Talib, could we say with any degree of confidence, I mean, we listen to, the polls and what they tell us, we listen to the election rhetoric, that most new immigrants will be voting Democratic?
I have a population, just for example, of about 30, maybe 40% immigrants. And of course, that's probably one of the most diverse populations because they're from different places in Africa, we're talking about Nigeria, Senegal, et cetera. And most of them are leaning, obviously, Democrat because of what they're hearing really concerns them from the other side.
Despite the fact that, we hear that many of the immigrants who come to this country also have conservative values, do they not lean towards Republicans in any way?
Yes, they have. But again, this particular cycle, because of what they're hearing, really concerns them because of the relationship that they have in the country and also with those with ties or those back home as well.
George, the polling company Latino Decisions tells us that Hispanics will be a very important voting bloc in this election. What are the major issues that Hispanics are focusing on?
Well, when it comes to the election and to issues of elections and civic engagement, I think we're trying to create a system that's more reflective of the communities that we come from. So we want to have the healthy public discourse on all of these issues. There isn't like a magical serum that the Hispanics drink that makes us all think the same thing. We have a lot of different ideas about any issue you want to talk about, but the bottom line is that the government that we have is not fully reflective of our communities, and we're electing people that are not reflecting what our values are. So anything from women's rights to global warming and the future of the planet to food access, food sovereignty, and these systems that are really damaging people, and all the different ways that the modern industrialized world is hurting communities of color. Those are the big issues that that we need to talk about, that any presidential nominee or anyone else needs to talk about, from the school board and city council on up.
Right, but certainly I guess the immigration debate must be resonating with many Hispanics right now.
Well, I can speak as far as in New Mexico. We have families and communities that have been here in this land for hundreds of years, for generations. At one time it was known as Mexico, and currently it's known as the United States of America. And so when you talk about immigration, you have to consider that historical legacy of what that actually means, where people were disenfranchised in their own home, made to be a stranger in their own in their own land, and it's sort of a process of reclaiming that. So, we really have to challenge that idea that Mexican people are coming in to assimilate and become Americans. The place where I live, which you can see behind me, we have a very special culture here, a Chicano culture that combines a lot of different people from a lot of different places. So when we need to kind of get away from the frame of people coming to assimilate into this democracy that we have, because we really need to transform this democracy, and we need it to assimilate to the people that it serves.
Right, and let me go to David. David, Asian American voters have not turned up in very high numbers in the last election. That was the election in 2012. Only 47% turned out. Do you think that's likely to change in this election?
Absolutely. In 2012, Asian Americans were about 8 million nationally. Now we're up to 9.3 million, a significant growth in 4 years of 1.3 million new voters across the country. In key battleground states such as Nevada and Virginia, Asian Americans are over 10% of the electorate. Asian Americans are excited about this election. They are invigorated. We are registering record numbers of voters at immigration ceremonies. The rhetoric from Donald Trump and from the Republicans, frankly, scares a lot of Asian Americans, and many have become citizens because they are fearful that a Trump presidency may mean the loss of freedoms and benefits that they enjoy today as residents of the United States. So more and more people are becoming citizens, registering to vote, and getting involved. And I think we're going to have very high Asian American turnout nationally in this country, and particularly in the battleground states of Nevada and Virginia.
Right, and Thomas, if we look at how the voters, how it breaks down from the one party to the other, if we look at the recent election cycles, are Democrats getting a bigger and bigger share of the vote in those states that we've been talking about, those battleground states?
Sure. Yeah, and in fact, if you look across the last several decades, the states where Democrats have improved their position the most, including those battleground states, are also states where the naturalized population has grown the most. The states that David just mentioned, Nevada, Virginia, throw in Florida, New York, New Jersey, some of the states that aren't battleground states. These have been growing increasingly Democratic, in part because of the transformation of the population over time. And part of that, a very important part of that story, has been the increased size of the immigrant population.
And Talib, if you are sitting there as a Democrat election organizer right now, there's a problem that you're facing right now. As we've been reporting, as many in the media have been reporting, many people are immigrants are trying to get citizenship in time to vote in the next election. But the Obama administration itself tells us that in many instances, that's not going to happen because we have a huge backlog, an admin backlog. We're not going to get there.
Yeah, that certainly is a challenge. In fact, one of my members just recently, they've gotten citizenship, but even he's just getting it. But he's not going to be able to vote even in this cycle right now. We have many in the pipeline, as you said, and that is a challenge right now because we're not finding a way to expedite that, backlog that we have.
And do we have any idea of how many people will get there?
I haven't heard any numbers on terms of how many we're going to be able to get out of that pipeline. But we know it's quite a bit because, again, they're very anxious about getting in this election and voting.
And just one other thing that, we talked about earlier when we look at who's voting for whom. I mean, as you pointed out, most people will be voting, most new immigrants will be voting for the Democrat Party. The color of immigrants has changed in this country. Say, if we look at the 1970s and we look now, the 1970s was mostly white. Now it's mostly people who are not white.
Yes, and that's certainly the case. Again, having three identities here at the panel here, being a religious identity, being Muslim, being a racial identity, being an African American, and then national identity, being an American. The religious identity is where we have a lot of diversity, and that color is coming from different parts of the world. The Muslim community is probably the most diverse in America right now. And of course, they are really waiting because they're very concerned. They don't know what's going to happen. So they want to get in this vote, get in the race to vote.
George, President Obama has tried to get immigration reform in this country. He's failed with Congress so far. And in fact, one of his executive actions that he took also failed in the U.S. Supreme Court when they blocked his move to try and get a pathway to residence for about 5 million undocumented people here in this country. Do you believe that that is going to be an important issue? It will be back on the agenda, whomever becomes the new president?
Yeah, I believe so. Immigration reform is something the country has needed for a long time, and it's going to be an issue beyond, I believe, beyond obviously the election cycle and whoever gets elected. It's something that has some deep-rooted problems in the country, and it takes a long time to fix things, that are like that. And it goes far beyond as well. Any office, like the office of the president or any other office, requires a lot of work on the ground. It's very uplifting to hear about the work organizing that I'm just hearing right now within the Muslim community, the Asian American community. In this election we have coming up, we're going to have more women, people of color, black and brown, Native, Asian American, all of these groups of people. There's going to be more engagement in this election than we have ever had in the history of the country. This is about as close as we're going to get to having an election that is reflective of the populace. And that's something to be really excited about. So there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric that's been touched on in this election that we get from a lot of different places. And it's something that our communities have to deal with on a daily basis that is horrible. But at the same time, there's a lot that we can feel proud about. We have communities here that are building a new country right now, and this election is just a part of that. And but we have leaders that are out there every single day, whether it be students and teachers, farm workers, small business owners, young people. all of these people are our leaders that are kind of leading us into this, brave new world here in the country. So I don't think anyone is waiting for the immigration reform for us to address the problems that we're having in our communities.
Right, David, when we look at the Asian American vote in the United States, there was a really interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal not so long ago which pointed out that if we look at the Senate, the U.S. Senate election in the state of Virginia 2 years ago, it was Asian Americans that put the winner, which was Mark Warner, over the top. How does that look if we expand that, if we extrapolate that nationally?
Well, if you look at a state like Nevada, where the Asian American population is growing very rapidly, it's in fact one of the fastest growing populations in that state, as it is across the country, you can see a day in the near future where Asian Americans may outpace African Americans and other groups, established voting groups, as influential not only in state politics but in national politics. We're seeing the same thing in Virginia. There's a large Asian American population in Virginia. They are becoming activated, registering to vote. And guess what? Over half of them are registering as Democrats. Only about 12% are Republicans. So the Democrats enjoy a wide margin over Republicans, and that's because the Republicans are driving Asian Americans away with their anti-immigrant, anti-ethnic rhetoric. We're seeing activism at San Francisco State, where I teach, reminiscent of the 1960s, where we're seeing young people from all colors, all races, getting involved in this election. Young leaders who are organizing clubs, who are getting people to vote, who are out at immigration naturalization ceremonies, registering people to vote. It's really ignited an entire generation of millennials who are invested in this country and want to have a say in this election. This is happening at the same time that nationally, Asian American organizations from New York to San Francisco to Washington, D.C. are working together collectively to register our community members to vote, to educate them on the issues and get them out to vote on Election Day. And this is such a critical time for everybody. It's just palpable in the air. There's such excitement. People want to be heard, and they want to send a loud and clear message to the rest of America that what's important to us is what's important to the country. We want the right to pursue the American dream. That's why immigrants have come to the United States for a better future. We're not here, we are here to be part of the American dream. And I think so many immigrants in this country feel marginalized and feel that the rhetoric from Trump and the Republicans have left nothing for us in the Republican Party, and that's why they're flocking to the Democratic Party right now.
All right, and as you point out, people want to be heard. The question is, are they being heard? That's an issue I want to talk about in the second part of the show. We're going to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the growing interest by immigrant voters in this year's U.S. presidential election. Let's get back to our panel right now. Thomas, we heard David Lee say a moment ago that people want to be heard. Do you believe that there is enough of an outreach, an election campaign outreach by Hillary Clinton and the Democrat Party to minority voters, to immigrant voters, or are they just taking it for granted that these are the voters who are going to vote Democratic?
They shouldn't take it for granted, and I don't think they are. I mean, everything I've read suggests that they have pretty significant outreach efforts in all these communities. And I think that that reflects the fact that they are being heard by the Democratic Party. Certainly not heard to the extent maybe that they would wish, but at the same time, it's important to understand that all of these different groups, these immigrant groups, are pretty diverse in what it is they actually want from their leaders, from elected officials within each of the communities we've been talking about. I think there's also a lot of diversity of opinion. So sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what the message is that you should be responding to. But overall, the message of more humane immigration policy is, I think, the message coming from the Democratic Party. And it's the message that the Clinton campaign is trying to get out there. And I think it will be effective. I think it will help maybe boost turnout. I think their turnout efforts will focus on some of these communities. And I think the message will help sort of buttress the Democratic inclinations.
Talib, there was one interesting figure I saw while researching the show, and that was there are going to be 11 million more voters in this election than there was in 2012. 11 million, that's huge growth. But the important thing is that of that 11 million, 2/3 are going to be from minority groups, racial minorities or ethnic minorities. What's the significance of that? Is that being seen and heard by the politicians out there?
I think it's being heard when we start to look at what the campaigns are saying. And we know we have a platform, we have national movements going on now that have access to the candidates' staff, and we see some of these items getting into their speaks in terms of what we're saying about immigration, particularly anti-Muslim rhetoric. Those things are being addressed as well. So it's going to be very significant because we look at that number you just mentioned, that 11 million, and then that 2/3. Then there's another population behind them, and so that we see now the demographics are going to continue to change towards this more diversified country that we have.
George, Mother Jones magazine reported that large numbers of white millennials in this election will support third-party candidates like Gary Johnson, like Jill Stein. Do we know if that is the case among Latin millennials as well?
Well, I think one of the lessons that we draw from a lot of those numbers and statistics about millennials is that they are not satisfied with the two-party system, and I think that extends to minority groups here in New Mexico and across the country. The two-party system, it's maybe dying. I mean, it might be sinking into the ocean. So I don't think that brown people need to jump onto that ship as it's sinking right now. So just winning over minority groups to the Democratic Party isn't enough. We need to change the electoral system that we have, the political systems that we have that have marginalized and disenfranchised groups for hundreds of years. It's a very long legacy of disenfranchisement, and a change in messaging documents from the top candidates is not going to change those deep-rooted problems. So unfortunately, we have Donald Trump that has sort of shifted the entire debate. Obviously, his rhetoric is utterly unacceptable and foolish, and just being better than that is still not good enough. Just because you're better than unacceptable is not good enough, and it's not going to reach these young people. So the young Chicano, Black, Native, Latino, if you like, the young people that I organize with in my organization and in other groups here in Albuquerque, they're not happy with this electoral system. They're not happy with the two-party system. And a lot of the nominees, the choices that they have in front of them, it's not the ticket. You know, they're looking within. They're turning to each other. They're turning to local leaders to solve these problems, because the change that is needed is so vast and so deep that we can't depend on a major party nominee to bring us there. It's going to take a lot more work than that. And that's the part that's so uplifting about this election right now. You were touching on it with these numbers. I mean, we're going to see more women and people of color and young people engaged in this election than we have ever seen. So the future is very bright right now, although the election season, I think it brings everybody down a little bit, including young people and including communities of color. But there's a lot to be happier about right now, and I think there's a lot of hope.
And Talib, that question that George raises is an important question. It's a broader question on the minority vote, which is not particularly relevant to this election, but are we likely to see in the future minority parties emerge that represent minority interests rather than minority just following the two existing parties?
Well, when you look at the demographic surge and what the country's going to look like 50 years from now because the demographics have been set, right, that's a strong possibility that's going to happen. And so that's why I can see some of the parties now. Obviously, we know which parties are not listening, but those are starting to listen because they obviously have looked at those numbers in terms of where it's going, and they're going to have to serve that population.
Right. David, I want you to take a listen to two differing views on Donald Trump's immigration policy. Let's watch.
When he talks about making America great again, it doesn't give me the feeling that I'm included in that, even though I'm a second generation, Chinese American, because I don't look like him.
The Trump message is actually just very clear, right? He wants to encourage people to follow the rules, and that's the bottom line, right? If we didn't have so much illegal immigration into the United States, we would actually be able to have more legal immigration, and that's what we really want.
So, David, listening to those two voices do both of them have a point?
I think the first voice, clearly reflects a lot of the sentiment here, I can tell you, in San Francisco. The rhetoric that let's make America great. Great for whom? For a lot of us, I'm fourth generation Chinese American. A lot of other immigrant groups who are second or first generation don't feel that they had it so good in Trump's America. And today we're seeing much more diversity, much more openness in our society than we did in that vision of America that Trump is talking about. So I hear a lot of concern out there when we hear Trump talking about let's make America great again. Great for whom? We want an America that's open for everybody. And particularly for immigrant communities, we just want a chance to be able to pursue our American dream and to be part of this great society.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Aaron Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.